When this man heard that his daughter had woken up from a deep, comatose state, he was overjoyed. He couldn't wait to hold his beautiful girl again and tell her he loved her. But her response when she saw him wasn't welcoming at all. "You can't be here," were her opening words. Woman wakes up from coma, looks at Dad, and says, "You can't be here." Mark hastily made his way through the hospital, trying to reach his daughter's room as quickly as possible. His heart was beating in his chest, and when he opened the hospital room door and saw the open eyes of his daughter, tears rolled down his cheeks. But then Mark's daughter gave an unexpected response. Mark expected a happy face to look back at him when he stepped into the room and held his daughter, Julia. But what he got was quite the opposite. Julia's eyes widened as she saw her father enter. But it was a gaze of pure panic. "You can't be here." Those were her first words. Confusion hit Mark as he heard those words. He didn't get this. He expected a happy reunion with his daughter, who was in a coma for over a month. But this first impression was sad, to say the least. How could this be her response? Especially after all that had happened. Mark felt a deep sadness rush through his body after hearing those 4 heartbreaking words. He thought back to that horrible day a little over a month ago. The day his life got turned upside down because of a horrible phone call made by the local police regarding his daughter. The police called Mark early on a Monday morning. Immediately after hearing the officer's tone, Mark could tell that something was wrong. The officer started with an apology because he was about to bring some sad news. It turned out that his daughter's car had been involved in an accident. When police arrived on the scene, it was clear that a collision had occurred. Julia's car was lying upside down in a ditch with apparent signs of being hit by another vehicle. The other driver was nowhere to be found, but Julia was left with the severe consequences of the accident. Her car's front end was fully caved in, but no trees or other road structures were damaged. They also found the broken bumper from a vehicle that wasn't hers. So, a hit and run was their conclusion after a brief investigation. A horrible accident that left Julia severely injured is a result. The poor woman was hurriedly brought to the hospital by present medical staff. Shortly afterward, Mark was informed by the police officer about his daughter's accident. Mark couldn't believe it and got into his car in a hurry. But when he arrived at the hospital, his daughter was already placed in an artificial coma. Mark told the medical staff that this was the most horrible thing he ever had to go through. Seeing your daughter in this state is a sight no father should ever have to go through. A month of pain and sadness followed for the worried father until the phone rang again this very morning. When Mark received the call about an hour ago from the hospital, stating that his daughter was about to wake from her coma, Mark couldn't be more happy. Mark sprung into action instantly after hanging up the phone. He got the car keys from the dining room table and rushed over to his car. He needed to get to the hospital as quickly as possible and set off in a hurry. He was going to be reunited with his baby girl and was over the moon to see Julia's beautiful smile once more. But apparently, Julia was not that happy to see him again. As Mark stepped further into the room, he noticed that a female doctor was also present. She stood in the far corner and was finishing up her notes before leaving. The white-coated woman walked toward Mark and stated that she was the doctor who had called Mark with the joyful news that day. Julia's recovery and sudden release from her comatose state was remarkable and unexpected, she stated. The female doctor had never seen anything like it before. "We still don't know how it happened, but I knew I had to call you immediately," the doctor said with a smile on her face. The female doctor saw Mark's worried look and knew it was related to the words his daughter had just spoken. She explained that it was possible for his daughter's mind to be fuzzy after waking from her slumber. But Mark and the doctor didn't realize that Julia chose her words very carefully. After this brief explanation, the doctor left the room so Mark could reunite with his daughter privately. The door was left open in case they needed further help, but now Mark and Julia were the only 2 people remaining in the room. Julia still looked at her father with a frightened look, though. Mark stepped closer slowly, still wondering what was startling his daughter this much. It was a mind-boggling question that would not take long to get answered. The sobbing father inched closer to the hospital bed and saw his daughter's behavior become increasingly fidgety. "You can't be here," she said again. "What does that mean, darling?" Mark asked his daughter. Julia didn't answer, so Mark continued his worried questioning. He asked his daughter how she was feeling and what was going on, referring to her previous remarks. Julia fell silent for a moment and then said, "I am in danger, Daddy." Mark's eyes seemed to grow almost twice in size. He was already on edge, but this remark pushed him straight over. Worried thoughts built up inside him as he saw how seriously his daughter spoke those words. This wasn't a hazy woman who just woke up. She was being genuine. "What danger are you talking about?" Mark asked his frightened daughter. He was now crouched beside the bed and staring into Julia's eyes from up close. Julia said she couldn't explain, but it was safest for her father to leave the room now. A tear rolled down her cheek while she said that. Mark was already anxious before Julia continued her incoherent story, but with every sentence she added, the worried father became more and more restless. He placed a hand on Julia's shoulder and tried to comfort his daughter, but then both father and daughter heard a sound coming from the hallway. It started with heavy footsteps moving behind the hospital room's wall. Mark noticed that her daughter responded negatively when she heard them. Then a voice accompanied those footsteps, and Julia really started to panic. "What's wrong, honey?" Mark asked his daughter as he gazed toward the room's entrance with an intrigued look. After a few seconds, the voice and footsteps came together and showed Mark a tall, slender man in a white robe. It was a male doctor who stared at his notepad as he walked into the room. He seemed fixated on his notes. But when he looked up and saw Julia's open eyes, he gasped. Mark watched as the male doctor clenched his notepad tightly before turning around and exiting the room in haste. It was like he had seen a ghost. And he wasn't the only one responding intensely to this weird interaction. Julia was in full panic mode and was hyperventilating even after the doctor left the area. Mark was confused and had a weird gut feeling. There was something going on here that wasn't right. So, after he managed to calm his daughter's breathing down a bit, the protective father rushed over to the hallway in search of this mysterious doctor. The hospital wing was filled with people. But the doctor's appearance would make him easy to spot. The man was abnormally tall, much taller than most visitors that roamed the hospital's hallways. So, after a quick scan of the surrounding area, Mark managed to spot the white-robed man moving around a corner at the far end. Mark quickly followed. The corner was at least 100 feet removed from his daughter's room, but Mark closed that gap quickly. He turned the corner himself and managed to grab the doctor's shoulder just before he was able to sneak into another room. The man turned around and still had the same fear in his eyes. "Who are you? And why did you look scared when you saw my daughter? And more importantly, why did Julia freak out when she saw you?" Mark put on the toughest voice he could muster. He was normally quite a friendly guy, but when it came to his daughter, he was not messing around. The mysterious doctor's voice was shaky at first, but after he exhaled a couple of times, he introduced himself as Dr. Arthur Carlson. He worked in this hospital and was the appointed doctor for his daughter's care over the past month. And that's when he told the reason for his surprised reaction. "I had not heard yet that your daughter had woken up and was not expecting her to recover this quickly. So you could imagine my surprise when I stepped into her room just now." The explanation seemed valid, but as Mark inspected the doctor's body language, he felt something was off. For some reason, Mark could tell that the doctor was lying. There was just one problem. He had no way of proving that this hunch was, in fact, true, so he had no choice but to let the doctor go. Mark left the man to his work but wasn't done with this case just yet. The suspicious father walked to the front desk, where hospital staff was working, and asked for more information on this so-called Dr. Arthur Carlson. He wanted to know the extent of this man's relationship with his daughter. Unfortunately, the front desk staff confirmed that Arthur was indeed Julia's personal doctor. This confirmation added credibility to the doctor's story, but the following information raised a few eyebrows. The staff told Mark that the moment Julia rolled into the hospital in her critical condition, Dr. Carlson jumped on the case. He stated that he wanted to be the only doctor to help her. "Is this typical?" Mark asked the woman behind the desk. The nurse shook her head and explained that usually an entire team would care for a patient in Julia's condition. She stated that she initially found the doctor's request odd but blamed it on his dedication to helping people as an experienced doctor. After hearing this statement, Mark let out a sarcastic grin. He made it no secret that he sincerely doubted the doctor's noble intentions. Mark was an excellent judge of character, and he spotted Dr. Carlson's fake demeanor from a mile away. "Where's the doctor now?" he asked the nurse. The nurse clearly felt the pressure of Mark's demanding voice. Her face turned red as she gazed at her computer screen. Scanning through the hospital's database, she quickly arrived with an answer. The woman stated that Dr. Carlson was in surgery at the moment since the operation started about 10 minutes ago. But this information was incorrect, and Mark did not hesitate to point out the mistake. He explained that he had just spoken to Dr. Carlson about a minute ago, and he was nowhere near an operating room. The man was lying to him and to the hospital's system about his whereabouts. The nurse behind the counter looked up at Mark with a worried look on her face. And that stare made Mark think back to his daughter back in the hospital room. He thought about her frightened state and the words of danger she spoke to him. And that's when it hit him. "Julia!" Mark screamed. Mark turned around and rushed back to the room where his daughter lay in bed, ordering the present hospital staff to join him. Together with 4 staff members, Mark managed to reach the room. The door was closed this time, but when the worried father opened it, all of them were in shock. Inside stood Dr. Carlson. The man held his hand over Julia's mouth so she couldn't yell for help, and he was holding a needle in the other hand. It was clear that he was about to insert some sort of fluid into her drip, and it was also clear that it was against Julia's will. This time, Mark didn't need to convince the hospital staff to act. The 4 doctors and nurses accompanying him rushed into the room and pushed Dr. Carlson away from the bed. The man was tackled to the ground, and security was called for backup. Julia exhaled a sign of relief. That's when the poor girl started talking. Her explanation was even more shocking than Mark could have imagined. Julia stated that she didn't remember much from the car accident, just that some headlights popped up right before she blacked out. But she remembered Dr. Carlson's footsteps and voice all too well. She was placed into a comatose state by Dr. Carlson himself. However, the dosage of painkillers and sleeping agents was not administered to help her get better. They were injected to keep Julia quiet. Because of her unconscious state, she was unable to speak or communicate. But she could hear everything. And Dr. Arthur Carlson was a talker. While Julia was under, he returned to her bed multiple times a week to administer the sleeping agent that kept her under. But while doing so, he also confessed about the car crash, of which he was a part. Because it turned out he was the other driver. Dr. Carlson was afraid that she witnessed him driving up to her before the crash. And his implication in the hit-and-run could cause him to lose his medical license. That was the reason why he placed her into the coma, so he could figure out what to do next. But the funny thing was that Julia never saw his face before, during, or after the accident. He was fully in the clear. His true crimes only started after Julia arrived at the hospital. His illegal sedation of the poor woman and his spoken confession at her bed was his downfall because Julia heard all of it. And then Faith took a wrong turn for the desperate doctor. Julia's body was stronger than he anticipated, and he started to become immune to the drugs he gave her. Dr. Carlson added the liquid comatose drug 3 times a week. But after a while, her body resisted and woke up on its own. It was something he had not anticipated, and before he knew it, other doctors had taken notice of her awakening state and called her father. This started the hellish roller coaster he was in right now. And this nightmare was about to come to its conclusion. The other doctors picked up the needle Dr. Carlson dropped. They analyzed its contents and quickly confirmed that he was guilty of placing Julia in a coma against her will. The corrupt doctor was arrested shortly after and was sent to 5 years in prison. Not for the accident he feared so much, but for all the crimes he knowingly committed afterward. After the dust of that day settled, Julia recovered quickly. Within a few weeks, she was allowed to leave the hospital and started her recovery process at home. Mark was over the moon to have his smiling daughter back, and Julia could finally embrace her father with zero fear in her heart.